Wow. Interesting. And you mentioned hydrogen. I just thought, this is a little aside, but in the Q3 2024, there were 99 hydrogen cars sold in the entire country, all in California, obviously, because of the infrastructure, but just 99, not too much. But on another note, because we mentioned California, I kind of want to talk to you about the push and pull factors, because we talked about this earlier. And how does California get such high EV adoption rates? And I kind of want to discuss how these push and pull factors can really affect consumers buying EVs and mass EV adoption in general.
Yeah, so look, I think that there are two things that are driving companies to build electric vehicles. And one of those things is regulation, right? So there are two kinds of regulations in the US that are driving electrification. The first is federal regulation, and the second is a set of regulations that comes out of the state of California. In the 1970s, the Clean Air Act amendments gave California some special authorities to make its own policy with respect to automotive emissions. And then they told all of the other states that they had the option to either opt into federal regulations or they could opt into California's regulations. And one of the interesting parts of this is that California's regulations had to be at least as stringent as the federal regulations. So when they made these laws, they knew that they were going to get a second set of laws that were either equally stringent or more stringent as compared to federal laws. So California has, generally speaking, been significantly more stringent than the federal government with respect to its emissions regulations. In 1990, they took kind of a quantum leap in stringency when they instituted what was called the low emission vehicle rule, which required a few things, but for our purposes, the most important of them was it required that a certain percent of the vehicles sold in the state of California had to be electric. If these aren't the exact numbers, but just, for example's sake, they said to automakers, if you sell 100 cars here, one of those cars has to be electric. And they ratcheted up that number over the course of the 90s. There was kind of a pause in the early 2000s, and then they started to ratchet it up again in the 2000s. And that's the policy roadmap that I was talking to you about. They had a clear set of regulations that were requiring automakers to sell more and more electric vehicles. Now, there are two things that the California Air Resources Board did that were really clever. The first was setting these sort of long horizons that gave automakers time to plan for these electric vehicles. The second, and perhaps just as important element, was to, every time an automaker sold an electric vehicle, hand them credits and create a market where these credits could be bought and sold amongst the automakers. What that meant was, if you didn't want to build electric cars, you didn't have to build an electric car, but you had to buy a credit from someone else who did build an electric car. And so that made space for companies like Tesla that were all in on electric cars to monetize the innovation that they were doing beyond the consumer. So in 2012, each Model S that sold was harvesting about $30,000 worth of ZEV credits, which is just an enormous amount of money when you're talking about a relatively low margin industry. So that really propelled Tesla's early growth. So that's what I would call the pull factor. That's a regulatory factor. In the past few years, America has gotten into the industrial policy side of the equation. And that's what I would call the push factor, which is basically subsidizing these new technologies. And we've always had some subsidies. We've had various EV purchase incentives from the federal government that really date back to the 2000s. But the IRA has doubled down on those push policies in a big way. They subsidize the extraction of rare earth elements that are required to build batteries for electric vehicles. They subsidize the construction of factories for electric vehicles and electric vehicle components, the production of battery cells, the production of battery packs, the sale of electric vehicles to consumers and also to commercial customers. the sale of used electric vehicles, and then the disposal of those vehicles in various ways, converting their batteries into energy assets that can be used in its second life, and the recycling of those batteries as well. So there's just a lot of push policy that's being applied to the EV market today. And I think one of the things that we worry about with the Trump administration and unified Republican control of Congress is that either those push policies or those pull policies, or both of them, will be dramatically diminished. And sometimes the changes that you get when you pull one of those pieces off the board are nonlinear, right? So you could remove the pull policies and end up with extremely large drop in EV sales, or similar situation for the push policies.
It's interesting to hear